the garbage will, and the cemetery laugh. The rain didn't feel like a blessing, it felt like a burial. I stood at the edge of the open grave, my black dress soaked through, watching the mahogany casket of my father, Marcus Sterling, being lowered into the cold, indifferent earth. He was the titan of Sterling real estate, a man who built a skyline, yet here he was, reduced to a box and silence. But the silence didn't last long. Before the first shovel of dirt hit the wood, a sharp, metallic click echoed. It was my stepmother, Evelyn, snapping open her designer clutch. There was no grief on her face, only a predatory sharpness that made my skin crawl. Beside her stood my half-brother Chad, smirking as he checked his gold watch, clearly bored by the inconvenience of his father's funeral. "Well, Clara," Evelyn's voice cut through the rain like a serrated knife. "Since you were always Daddy's little favorite, I thought I'd give you a head start on the news. We wouldn't want you getting too comfortable in the estate tonight." She thrust a laminated document toward me. My hand shook as I grabbed it. The bold headers burned into my retinas. Last Will and Testament of Marcus Sterling. My eyes scanned the legal jargon until they hit the poison. To my wife, Evelyn Sterling, and my son, Chad Sterling, I bequeath all shares, properties, and liquid assets. To my daughter, Clara Sterling, for her consistent lack of discipline and failure to contribute to the family legacy, I leave nothing but the clothes on her back. She is to be vacated from all family premises immediately upon my passing. "Lack of discipline?" I whispered, my voice trembling with a mix of shock and pure, unadulterated rage. "I spent 3 years by his bedside. I was the one who managed his dialysis, who handled the board members when he couldn't speak, who stayed awake while you were touring the Mediterranean with your tennis instructor. You forged this. You had to." Evelyn stepped closer, the smell of her expensive perfume clashing with the scent of wet earth. "Careful, Clara. Slander is expensive, and you're currently a beggar. The lawyer, Mr. Thorne, witnessed the signing. The fingerprints are his. You were just the unpaid nurse, darling. Now, you're just a trespasser." Chad let out a jagged laugh. "Don't forget to leave the keys to the Porsche at the gate, sis. That's Sterling property now. Maybe you can find a job cleaning the floors you used to walk on." An hour later, I was literally tossed into the gutter. 2 of the estate's security guards, men I used to give Christmas bonuses to, grabbed me by the arms and hauled me past the iron gates of Sterling Manor. My suitcase, packed in haste under Evelyn's watchful eye, was thrown after me. It burst open, my life's belongings spilling into the muddy driveway. I knelt in the dirt, clutching a wet sweater to my chest, listening to the gates hiss shut. But as I reached into the mud to grab my fallen jewelry box, my fingers brushed against something hard and cold. It was the locket. A heavy, tarnished silver heart my father had forced into my hand the night before he died. He had been delirious, whispering, "Don't trust the paper, Clara. Find the light." I had thought it was just the ramblings of a dying man, but as the locket caught the dim street lamp light, I noticed a tiny, microscopic seam along the edge. I pressed a hidden stud, and the locket didn't open to a photo. Instead, a slim, high-capacity USB drive slid out of the silver casing. I looked back at the sprawling mansion, the lights glowing warmly where my father's murderers were likely toasting with his vintage scotch. They thought they had left me with nothing. They thought they had burned my world to the ground. They didn't realize I now had the matches. The cheap motel room smelled of stale cigarettes and desperation, but I didn't care. I sat on the edge of the sagging bed, the silver USB drive plugged into my battered laptop, the only thing the guards hadn't smashed during my eviction. As the files loaded, my breath hitched. My father wasn't just a businessman. He was a meticulous record keeper. He knew Evelyn was poisoning his legacy long before the illness took his body. The drive was a digital fortress. It contained thousands of hidden audio recordings from the master bedroom, offshore bank statements linked to Chad's gambling debts, and most importantly, the real will. In the original document, Father had left me 51% of Sterling real estate, the controlling interest. Evelyn and Chad were to receive a modest stipend, contingent on a drug test and a morality clause. "You greedy idiots," I whispered, a cold smile spreading across my face. "You didn't just steal my inheritance, you signed your own death warrants." But I couldn't just walk into a police station. Mr. Thorne, the family lawyer, was in their pocket. If I moved too fast, the evidence would disappear, and I'd end up in a ditch alongside my father. I needed to play the long game. I needed to let them think they had utterly destroyed me. For the next 3 weeks, I became a ghost. I took a job waitressing at a high-end lounge where Chad frequented. I wore a wig, heavy glasses, and a uniform that made me invisible. I watched them. Evelyn was already planning a celebration of life gala, a thinly veiled victory party at the Sterling Manor. She was auctioning off my father's private art collection to liquidate assets and move the money to a shell company in the Cayman Islands. One night, while serving a tray of overpriced scotch to Chad's table, I heard it. "The transfer happens on the night of the gala, Thorne," Chad bragged, his voice slurred. "Once the Star of the Orient diamond is sold at the auction, the money hits the offshore account, and we dissolve the Sterling Trust. By the time anyone looks for the original will, it'll be ashes in the fireplace." "And the girl?" Thorne asked, leaning in. Chad laughed, a sound that made my skin crawl. "Clara? I saw her yesterday digging through a trash can behind a diner. She's broken. She'll be dead or in a shelter by Christmas. She's a non-entity." I gripped the tray so hard, my knuckles turned white. A non-entity? Just wait. I spent my nights in that moth-eaten motel, using the USB's encrypted software to bypass the Sterling Manor security system. I wasn't just a nurse during my father's illness. I was his shadow. I knew every bypass code, every hidden camera, and every skeleton in those mahogany closets. 2 days before the gala, I made my move. I sent an anonymous tip to the Internal Revenue Service and the SEC regarding a massive money laundering scheme at Sterling Real Estate, time to be investigated exactly 48 hours later. Then I broke into the manor. I didn't take jewelry or cash. I went straight for the library. Behind the false front of the Great Gatsby, there was a safe. Using the code my father had whispered in his final hours, my birthday, I opened it. Inside wasn't money. It was the physical original will, stamped and notarized by a second secret lawyer my father had hired in secret. But as I turned to leave, the lights flickered on. "I knew I smelled a rat," a voice hissed. I froze. Standing in the doorway was Chad, a half-empty bottle of bourbon in one hand and a heavy brass fireplace poker in the other. He wasn't smiling anymore. His eyes were bloodshot and murderous. "Give me the paper, Clara," he snarled, stepping into the room. "Give it to me, or you won't live to see the sunrise." I backed away, my heart hammering against my ribs, clutching the real will to my chest. I was trapped in the library, the very room where my father had been betrayed. Chad raised the poker, his face contorted in rage. "You think you're so smart," he spat. "But dead girls don't inherit empires." Chad lunged at me, the brass poker whistling through the air. I dove behind my father's massive mahogany desk, the heavy wood splintering as the metal struck the edge. He was fueled by bourbon and desperation, but I was fueled by 3 weeks of pure, icy hatred. "You're pathetic, Chad," I yelled, scrambling toward the bookshelf. "You couldn't even kill a dying man without your mother holding your hand." "Shut up," he roared, swinging again. He was clumsy. I wasn't. I reached for the heavy crystal decanter on the side table and hurled it at his head. It missed, shattering against the wall, but it bought me 2 seconds. I bolted for the hidden service door behind the velvet curtains, a passage the servants used that Chad, in his arrogance, had likely forgotten existed. I slammed the door and bolted it from the inside, just as his weight crashed against it. "You're dead, Clara. You hear me? Dead." I didn't stop to listen. I sprinted through the narrow corridor, out the back entrance, and disappeared into the shadows of the estate's manicured gardens. I had the physical will, but that was only half the battle. I needed the world to watch them fall. The night of the Celebration of Life gala arrived. The Sterling Manor was ablaze with light, draped in faux mourning black and gold. The who's who of the city's elite were there, sipping champagne and bidding on my father's soul. Evelyn stood at the top of the grand staircase, wearing a diamond necklace that cost more than a hospital wing, playing the role of the grieving widow to perfection. "Marcus would have wanted his collection to be shared with the world," she told a reporter, her voice dripping with artificial honey. She didn't notice the tech crew setting up the oversized screens for the auction. She didn't notice the server with the heavy glasses and the wig moving silently through the shadows. The auction reached its climax, the Star of the Orient diamond. "Starting bid, $10 million, the auctioneer announced. The room went silent. Evelyn leaned over the balcony, her eyes glittering with greed. This was it, the final liquidation before she vanished to the Caymans. "15 million, a voice called out. Suddenly, the lights flickered and died. A gasp rippled through the ballroom. "What is the meaning of this?" Evelyn's voice shrilled from the darkness. The giant projector screens didn't show the diamond. Instead, they flickered to life with a grainy, high-definition video. The audio boomed through the professional sound system, drowning out the murmurs of the crowd. It was a recording from the master bedroom, 2 weeks before my father died. "Is the dose high enough?" Evelyn's voice echoed, cold and clear. "He's still lingering. I need Thorne to finish the signature on the new will before the old man kicks the bucket." "Relax, Mom," Chad's voice responded. "The doctor said the medication I'm slipping into his IV is undetectable. By Friday, Sterling Real Estate is ours. Clara will be out on the street where she belongs." The ballroom became a tomb. Every head turned toward the balcony. Evelyn's face was no longer that of a grieving widow. It was a mask of pale, frozen horror. "Turn it off!" Chad screamed, stumbling toward the tech booth. "Turn it off now!" But I wasn't done. I stepped out from behind the curtain, shedding the wig and the glasses, standing directly in the spotlight. I held the original will high above my head. "The auction is over," I announced, my voice steady and cold. "And so is the Sterling family lie." At that exact moment, the heavy oak front doors burst open. It wasn't more guests. It was the FBI and the SEC, led by an agent holding a stack of federal warrants. "Evelyn Sterling? Chad Sterling?" the agent called out over the chaos. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, securities fraud, and grand larceny." Evelyn looked at the crowd, then at the police, and finally at me. Her poise shattered. She let out a guttural scream and tried to run, but she tripped on the train of her $5,000 gown, tumbling down the marble stairs she had fought so hard to steal. She landed at my feet, face first in the spilled champagne of her own victory party. The silence that followed the clinking of handcuffs was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Evelyn lay sprawled at the base of the stairs, her designer gown stained with cheap champagne and the dust of her own downfall. As the FBI agents hauled her up, her carefully coiffed hair fell in matted clumps over her face. She looked like a broken doll, stripped of the wealth she had murdered for. Chad didn't even try to fight. He slumped against a pillar, sobbing like the coward he had always been, while Mr. Thorne, the loyal family lawyer, was already trying to cut a deal with the agents before they even reached the police car. "This isn't over, Clara," Evelyn shrieked as they dragged her toward the door. "You're nothing. You'll always be nothing." I didn't dignify her with a response. I simply watched as the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers faded into the night, taking the trash out of my father's house for good. The fallout was nuclear. The recordings I provided were the smoking gun. The medication Chad had been slipping into my father's IV was identified as a concentrated digitalis derivative, enough to cause heart failure while mimicking natural causes. Because they had successfully killed him, the charges were upgraded to first-degree murder. Evelyn and Chad turned on each other within 48 hours of being in separate interrogation rooms. Evelyn claimed Chad was the mastermind. Chad swore his mother forced him into it. In the end, the jury didn't care who held the syringe. They were both sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Mr. Thorne was disbarred and sentenced to 15 years for forgery and conspiracy. Every cent they had tried to hide in the Caymans was seized by the government to pay off the massive fines and back taxes they owed from their fraud. They went to prison with exactly what they tried to leave me. Nothing. 6 months later, I stood in my father's office at the top of the Sterling Tower. The Star of the Orient diamond sat on my desk, returned to the estate after the auction was declared void. I had spent the last half year cleaning house. I fired every board member who had looked the other way while Evelyn was in charge, and replaced them with the people my father had actually trusted, the ones who cared about the skyline, not just the bottom line. My phone buzzed. It was a notification from the prison system. Evelyn had requested a meeting to discuss her living conditions. I deleted the notification without reading it. She wanted mercy? She could find it in the chapel of the state penitentiary. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city. The rain was gone, replaced by a brilliant golden sunset that reflected off the glass of the buildings my father had built. I reached up and touched the silver locket around my neck. The USB was gone, but the weight of the silver felt different now. It didn't feel like a burden or a secret anymore. It felt like a key. "We did it, Dad," I whispered. I sat down at the mahogany desk, opened the first folder of the day, a proposal for a new low-income housing project, and picked up my pen. I wasn't just Marcus Sterling's daughter anymore. I was the CEO of Sterling Real Estate. And unlike the people who came before me, I earned every single floor.